Member Kelvin Davis to advise the House that this is not a split call. I call the Honourable Member Kelvin Davis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to speak on the Parole Extended Supervision Orders Amendment Bill, which touches on one of the priorities that I've set myself upon my return to Parliament, that is the elimination of sexual violence in New Zealand. And a couple of things I just have to take issue with my own colleague Carol Beaumont, who said that maybe we can't fully eliminate sexual violence from New Zealand. Mr Speaker, I believe that we must do everything in our power to ensure that we aim for the total elimination of sexual violence within New Zealand. It's not going to be an easy task, but we need to have that as our focus and not deviate from it. Also, just want to touch on the acknowledgements for the cross-party collaboration on this bill. It's good to see that on something as serious as sexual violence, that we can come together and put aside our party differences for the betterment of the most vulnerable in New Zealand. Mr Speaker, the extended supervision orders are used to manage a small number of child sex offenders who pose a high risk of causing serious harm after being released from prison at the end of their sentence. These orders can last for up to 10 years, beyond which the Department of Corrections is not able to manage these offenders, even if they continue to pose a high risk of serious harm to the public. The bill enables orders to be renewed as often as they are needed and expands the scope of orders beyond high-risk child sex offenders to include high-risk sex offenders against adults, as well as very high-risk violent offenders. And it's really important to note that sexual violence and just violence often go hand in hand, in particular in the domestic situations. The regulatory impact statement says if a sex offender against adults or a violent offender does not meet the stringent criteria for a public protection order, there are currently no other tools available to manage them at the end of a finite sentence. They would be unmanaged in the community as they have finished their sentence, and this bill, Mr Speaker, addresses that. In other words, there is another tool in which to manage the behaviour and manage these sexual offenders. I note that there is the concern that this bill may not be consistent with the Bill of Rights in terms of the retrospective penalties and double jeopardy. So the Select Committee does have a duty to really consider this bill, really to take it seriously and to try and maintain that balance between upholding the Bill of Rights but also protecting the most vulnerable in our society, that are our children, and also include our women in that. I also just have to make the point here, Mr Speaker, that we often talk about sexual violence and domestic violence as only man against woman, and I just want to make the point, because people have had me up about it in various hui, that we must remember that men are also victims of sexual and domestic violence, and we shouldn't downplay that. But it is a fact that about 90% of offences are committed by men. Mr Speaker, so the Labour Party believes that public safety should not be put at risk as a result of extended supervision orders expiring. We need long-term options for managing the risk of serious harm caused by high-risk groups. It's good to see this bill taking steps to achieve this. Labour is deeply concerned with the high incidence of family, domestic and sexual violence in New Zealand. Since 2008, there's been a 36% increase in the number of sexual violence recorded offences. It's now at the highest level ever recorded. And it's a pretty well-known fact that 1 in 8 men in New Zealand over their lifetime will experience sexual violence. 1 in 6 women will experience sexual violence, and for Māori women, that's 1 in 3. At a recent hui I had at Hoani Waititi Marae in West Auckland, where an organisation called Tu Wahine presented research on sexual violence, they came out with this pretty astounding set of figures that said in West Auckland, Central Auckland and on the North Shore, there are between 8,000 and 10,000 young men and 15,000 and 18,000 young women who have experienced sexual violence. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's just sexual violence. Between 23,000 and 28,000 young people under the age of 24 who have experienced sexual violence. That's not including domestic violence. That's not including witnessing domestic violence. That's not including Northland and Taitokoro or South Auckland or Waikato or Bay of Plenty or the rest of New Zealand. This is just Central, West Auckland and the North Shore. And we talk about the number of people who aren't achieving in school to the best of their potential. And when we think about that number of between 23 and 28,000 young people who have experienced sexual violence in just in those areas of Auckland alone, those young people are in classes each day, trying to learn, trying to focus on what the teacher's saying, but at the same time their heads are probably filled with what happened to them last night, quite possibly in the safety or the apparent safety of their own homes, by somebody that they know, they love and trust. And here we are, we're wondering why we have so many of our young people who aren't managing to achieve their potential in school. There was a recent report I read that said sexual violence drives women into poverty. It says that sexual violence inhibits their sense of agency. And agency is a term used to describe how people rise above their own circumstances and their situation and achieve regardless. And you think about it, the numbers of people who are women who are sexually abused or victims of domestic violence, they have this reduced sense of agency. They can't raise themselves above their circumstances. They don't achieve as well as they could. They don't get the qualifications that they maybe should. So they don't earn as much as they should. And then this has an impact on both the economy, and that we think about most women are mothers who do the shopping for their families. They have less money, but also what this does is it drives their families into poverty. So we can talk about feeding the kids as much as we want and as long as we want, and maybe what we need to consider is if we want to feed our kids, we need to look after their mothers first. We need to protect their mothers and the woman in society. Mr. Speaker, this House and the men in this House, I think we owe it to our wives and our girlfriends and our partners, our daughters, our mothers and our sisters, our friends and our colleagues around the House to really take this seriously, this issue of sexual violence and domestic violence. It's for the good of the whole country. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is a small step to protecting our women and our children, our most vulnerable. I'm proud that Labor not only supports it, but its genesis was back when Labor was government and Phil Goff kicked things off. Kia ora.
I call the honourable member Tim McIndoe. Tēnā koe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koe to you as well. I'd like to associate myself